What you see here is an Emirati weapons shipment after it was destroyed by the Saudi Air Force in the port of Mukalla, Yemen. Saudi Arabia struck the UAE with missiles, and this wasn't the only surprise. There were two more surprises. The second surprise was that as soon as Saudi Arabia attacked them, the UAE announced its complete withdrawal from Yemen. Thank you very much, sir. We'll pack up and leave. Here, you might think that the Emirati withdrawal from Yemen happened because of Saudi pressure, forcing them to withdraw. When she told them they had to withdraw in less than 24 hours, did the UAE really get scared and withdraw because of Saudi Arabia's threat? Or was all of this just a trap for Saudi Arabia? Here's the third surprise. The UAE didn't withdraw at all. The UAE is still present in Yemen and still controls southern Yemen. And the situation in Yemen could, God forbid, turn into the same situation that El Fasher in Sudan is suffering from. If you still haven't grasped this, let me tell you what the UAE did. Let's ask the important questions. How did the UAE withdraw, and why didn't it? Why, when Saudi Arabia bombed the UAE arms shipment, didn't it try to bomb the armored vehicles? What's the story with the Yemeni islands that the UAE controls and refuses to leave to this day? Is Saudi Arabia really ready to enter the war if the UAE doesn't withdraw? And the most important question of all, who are the mediating countries? To those trying to reconcile the UAE and Saudi Arabia to prevent war between them in Yemen, I say, may God bless you. These are the important questions. Let's answer them. What you see here is a map of the Yemeni islands controlled by the UAE, Socotra Island, which controls the Gulf of Aden, Mayun Island, located in the heart of the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and Zukar Island, which also controls the Bab al-Mandab Strait. The Yemeni government and people are accusing the UAE of occupying their islands, but the UAE responds to these accusations by saying it is protecting them from terrorist groups. So what exactly happened, and how did they manage to reach the islands in the first place? What happened is that after the UAE and Saudi Arabia entered Yemen in Operation Decisive Storm in 2015, within a few months, Saudi Arabia and the Yemeni government were preoccupied with their war against the Houthis. But they were surprised to find that the UAE had begun deploying its forces on the Yemeni islands. The Bab al-Mandab Strait and the Gulf of Aden mean that the UAE has managed to control the maritime shipping lanes upon which international shipping depends in the southern Red Sea. But what surprised the Yemeni people living on these islands was that the Emirati forces were removing the Yemeni flag from government buildings and raising the Emirati flag in its place. So, what are they thinking? Are you here to defend us or to occupy us? The UAE then began distributing food, water, and aid to the island's inhabitants as a gesture of goodwill. However, the Yemeni government was still displeased with what was happening. Keep in mind, we're talking about the government of Abd Rabbuh Mansur Hadi, who was originally allied with the UAE. He was allied with them, with the UAE and Saudi Arabia against the Houthis. So he and the UAE were supposed to be friends. But when he saw the UAE imposing its control over the islands, he told them, "This is unacceptable and must end." Of course, the UAE continued its control over the Yemeni islands as if it didn't even see Yemen. When Saudi Arabia saw that Yemen and the UAE had started fighting and forgotten about the war with the Houthis, it tried to intervene between them to resolve the issue. Guys, we have a war with the Houthis. The war is still ongoing. It hasn't ended. And Mr. Citizen, let me tell you that Saudi Arabia was absolutely right. The Houthis, for example, carried out an attack on the Saudi forces, which they called Victory from God at the time. This was on August 25, 2019. The operation was known at the time as Victory from God by al-Hussein. In this operation, according to their own statements published by Al Jazeera, they killed 500 Saudi officers and soldiers, not counting the wounded and the miners. It was almost the heaviest operation in the entire decisive storm war. So Saudi Arabia was absolutely right. You left me to fight the Houthis alone while you were fighting amongst yourselves. And you, UAE, what are you doing? What time is this? What islands are you controlling? But the UAE still refused to withdraw from the Yemeni islands. So, to resolve the issue and end the conflict between the UAE and Yemen, Saudi Arabia agreed with the Yemeni government to send Saudi forces to the same islands controlled by the UAE. And why? To ensure Yemen that the UAE won't resolve the island issue. Let's fight then. Let's see what war lies ahead. But after a little while, and pay attention to this detail because we'll need it later, Saudi Arabia and Yemen started pressuring the UAE to completely withdraw from the Yemeni islands. So the UAE actually complied. They said, "Okay, I'll pack up and leave." So far, so good. You say, good? I say, no, it's not good because before the UAE withdrew from the Yemeni islands, it built air bases and runways. And what was their excuse, sir? They said, so we can use them as supply lines to the islands after we leave. You say, supply lines for whom? Didn't the UAE withdraw from the islands? I say, supply lines for the armed groups that the UAE established on the Yemeni islands before leaving, including, and most importantly, the Southern Transitional Council forces that seized control of southern Yemen 2 days ago, which we've already discussed. His story. In detail in the Yemen War episode, we told how he managed to defeat the Saudi-backed forces. You can watch it in detail to learn everything that happened. So, what did the UAE do here? The UAE entered the Yemeni islands, restructured their infrastructure, built airports and runways, and established supply and support lines. Then they formed armed groups to fight in their place. After that, they withdrew. You don't want me? Fine, no problem. I'm leaving, but I'll leave my men in my place. And, my fellow citizens, to this day, the Yemeni islands are under the control of the UAE through the armed groups they formed on the islands before they left. Okay, let's set aside all that for now. It's dangerous and terrifying because these islands control the shipping lanes of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, but we'll put that aside for now and see what's next. When the UAE seized control of the Yemeni islands and no one stopped them, they said, why not try South Yemen? We took the islands, we'll take the whole south. But the new thing the UAE did in the south was that they didn't stop at just one armed group. The UAE has flooded southern Yemen with armed groups. The most prominent example is the Giants Brigades, which are deployed in Aden, the western coast, Al-Dalaya, Abyan, Shabwa, Mukrab, and Hadramaut. They support the Shabwa Defense Forces, formerly known as the Shabwani Elite Forces. Despite their defeat at the hands of the legitimate forces in 2019, the UAE exploited this defeat, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. They changed the name from the Shabwani Elite Forces to the Shabwa Defense Forces so that people would forget about the defeat. They continued to form and arm them and changed their name, but at the same time, they supported the legitimate forces that had defeated them and were the reason for the name change. So, even though the 2 forces are fighting each other, the UAE supports both of them so that they fight on its behalf by proxy. Is the UAE satisfied with this number of armed groups in southern Yemen? The answer is, of course, no. They also support the Hadrami elite forces. The forces deployed in Hadramaut supported the National Resistance Forces and the Republican Guard Forces, which are affiliated with the political bureau run by the family of former Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh. The commander of these forces is Tariq Saleh, the nephew of former Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was killed by the Houthis. We also told his story and the story of his death in the episode about the war in Yemen. So, while you're preoccupied with news of the UAE's withdrawal from Yemen, don't think that the UAE ran away just because Saudi Arabia burned a few of its vehicles in the port. Honestly, are you convinced that the UAE, which has been fighting the Sudanese army through the Rapid Support Forces for more than 2 years, a war in which we saw battles with fighter jets, drones, artillery, and tanks, a war in which we saw massacres, the latest being the massacre in El Fasher, do you really think that the UAE, which has been fighting in Sudan for 2 years, would run away from Yemen just because 2 or 3 of its vehicles were burned? Are you convinced of that? All that happened was that the same scenario of withdrawal from the Yemeni islands is the same scenario of withdrawal from southern Yemen. Armed groups have formed and taken control of southern Yemen completely, from beginning to end. The continued presence of Emirati forces in Yemen is no longer necessary, especially, and I emphasize especially, when Saudi Arabia violated all rules of engagement and directly targeted Emirati arms shipments for the first time. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia also explicitly mentioned the UAE by name for the first time in its statements about the airstrike it carried out on the port of Mukalla. And why go so far afield? Look at this video. This is the Yemeni port of Mukalla after the Saudi airstrike. While many vehicles were burned, the armored vehicles, which should have been the primary targets, were left untouched. Minutes later, all the armored vehicles left the port of Mukalla and continued on their way to the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council forces. And here we ask the question. The important question is, why didn't Saudi Arabia strike the armored vehicles? Why did they let them reach the UAE-backed forces? Let me tell you, you've forgotten an even more important question. When Saudi Arabia was monitoring the arms shipment from the moment it left the UAE until it reached Yemen, why didn't they strike it at sea and sink it before it reached Yemen? Why did they let it reach the port to strike it? Let me ask you a good question. Let's answer it. As soon as the arms shipment was unloaded from the ships at the port of Mukalla, the UAE played a very clever game. It's only natural, by the way, that they would play this game given their experience in the Sudan War. As soon as the armored vehicles were unloaded from the ships, the UAE moved them until they parked them next to the fuel tanks at the Yemeni port of Mukalla. Now, what would happen if the Saudi Air Force struck the armored vehicles while they were parked next to the fuel tanks? Remember the Beirut port explosion? The same thing could have happened in the port of Mukalla. The number of civilian casualties in Yemen would have been horrific. A massacre would have occurred at the hands of Saudi Arabia. So, the question is, did the UAE choose that specific location to use as bait for the Saudi Air Force? The international community is defending the UAE and condemning the Saudi attack, claiming it caused a massacre of innocent Yemeni civilians working at the port. God knows. Did the UAE use the fuel tanks to protect the armored vehicles? God knows. Was it a coincidence that the UAE parked the armored vehicles near the fuel tanks? Again, God knows. All we know is that the Saudi Air Force didn't target the armored vehicles to avoid the Yemeni fuel tanks exploding. So, when the armored vehicles moved out onto the streets and away from the fuel tanks, why didn't the Saudi Air Force target them? Let me tell you, you yourself answered the question. The armored vehicles reached the streets. This means that to destroy 50 or 60 armored vehicles, you would need 50 or 60 missiles. Do you know what that means? 50 or 60 missiles firing on the streets of Yemen, streets full of civilians. This would be a massacre far greater than the one that could have happened at the port. Therefore, you are left with only one conclusion. The Emirati armored vehicles reached the forces of the Southern Transitional Council, which is supported by the UAE. By the way, as a side note, these vehicles were accompanied by other containers loaded with weapons and ammunition. This information was given by the Saudi army, as they will tell you in a bit. The Saudi army recounted everything that happened. Now let's get to the most important question. Why didn't Saudi Arabia strike the ships at sea to avoid all these losses? Let's think about it logically. As long as the ships were at sea, can anyone prove that they were carrying weapons, equipment? A weapon that no one can control. Ships must reach ports and be inspected, or at least unload their cargo so the whole world can see what's happening. So, if Saudi Arabia had attacked the ships at sea, it would have been very easy. The UAE would have complained to the Security Council saying, for example, that the ships were carrying medicine and medical aid for the people of Yemen. Of course, Saudi Arabia would swear from now until tomorrow that the ships were carrying weapons, but to prove it, they would have to go into the ocean to retrieve the weapons and present them to the Security Council. Who would dive into the heart of the ocean to search for weapons? Therefore, Saudi Arabia had to wait until the ships arrived, and the UAE itself would unload their cargo, and the whole world would see it and confirm that they were transporting weapons. So, what did Saudi Arabia gain from this? It didn't destroy the weapons shipment, nor did it sink the ships before they arrived. What was the point of the airstrike that Saudi Arabia carried out? I'll tell you that Saudi Arabia carried it out for two reasons. The first reason is that Saudi Arabia had no other option. The UAE pressured them into attacking and accused them, for the first time, of arming militias and attempting the division of Yemen. The second reason is that Saudi Arabia saw the UAE doing in Yemen the same thing it did in Sudan and the same thing it did in the Yemeni islands. Therefore, Saudi Arabia knew for sure that if it took one step back, the UAE would take 10 steps forward. If Saudi Arabia hadn't responded to the UAE, it would have lost all of southern Yemen. It's true that the few cars that were burned in the port weren't significant, but the message here was more political than military. Saudi Arabia was telling the UAE, "I won't stay silent." Imagine that King Salman, who had almost never appeared in the media, reappeared specifically to condemn the UAE. The UAE, yesterday's ally, is today's enemy. Yesterday, Saudi Arabia bombed the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council forces without mentioning the UAE. Now, pay attention to the escalation. Today, Saudi Arabia bombed UAE weapons and mentioned the UAE by name. So, what will happen tomorrow? It will happen. With the escalation and developments, Saudi Arabia is supposed to strike Emirati forces, right? That's why the UAE told you, "No thanks, I'll withdraw my forces and leave." But here, the UAE achieved two gains. The first gain is that it protected its forces from any direct attacks from the Saudi Air Force. The Saudi Air Force started firing and engaging. So the UAE said, "What do I care? I'll go back to the old rules of engagement. We'll strike the Yemeni forces loyal to us. We won't strike each other. Whoever wants to strike should strike the Yemeni forces that the other side supports." The second gain the UAE achieved is that it implemented a repositioning of its forces. It withdrew its forces a step back and advanced the Yemeni forces it supports. They are the ones who will continue the war in Yemen by proxy, just as the Rapid Support Forces are also fighting by proxy in Sudan. Did the Sudanese people get their rights or wrongs from the UAE? The answer is no. Likewise in Yemen, do what you want with the Southern Transitional Council forces. I have nothing to do with it. The clever one among you will finish it off. On the second point, but who here is standing by, watching Iran and the Houthis? Imagine that the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who were fighting Iran yesterday, are the ones turning on each other today. So, if you were in Iran's place, what would you do? So, if you notice, Iran hasn't spoken about what's happening in Yemen, letting them finish each other off. Imagine all this animosity between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but neither of them can forget their enmity towards Iran. Iran is the one occupying the UAE islands. and it's the one that launched missiles at Saudi territory through the Houthis. So, neither of them can afford to be preoccupied with each other and forget about Iran, and they both know this. I told you in the last episode that international parties would intervene to reconcile the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and that's exactly what happened. America, Egypt, and Oman are the three mediating between the two sides to establish rules of engagement and restore relations to what they were. Consequently, whether the UAE and Saudi Arabia stay or go, they have no one but each other in confronting Iran. But the important thing for you to know here is that Saudi Arabia has one problem, and the UAE has two. Saudi Arabia's problem is that it can't give up southern Yemen because it represents its national security. This is all that's left for it in Yemen. The Houthis control northern Yemen, and the UAE controls the roots of Yemen. Therefore, only the south remains. Saudi Arabia cannot be isolated in the south. That's why Prince Mohammed bin Salman said it explicitly. Yemen is a red line for us. On the other hand, the UAE also has two problems. The first problem is that it has a plan to control the maritime routes, and it must be implemented. Indeed, the UAE has seized control of the region's islands and ports, and only southern Yemen remains for it to control the Gulf of Aden and the maritime passage that connects the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. As for the second problem that the UAE faces, it is its actual control over southern Yemen. It is already controlling southern Yemen, so why would it leave it for free? What is the point? Besides, it has withdrawn forces from the south, meaning that the ones who will pay the price for any new clashes are the Yemenis supported by the UAE. The UAE is finished. What? The UAE has no leverage left to twist. It won't do anything except support them with money and weapons, just like it's doing in Sudan. So what would make the UAE willing to give up southern Yemen to Saudi Arabia? That's the question Saudi Arabia needs to answer now. Because if it tries to fight the Southern Transitional Council, the outcome of the war isn't guaranteed. It's been fighting the Houthis for 10 years and hasn't been able to defeat them. Therefore, if it enters a new war in Yemen, it will be drained for years to come, and in the end, it will find the Houthis waiting to drain what's left of it. Here, Saudi Arabia has only one solution to resolve this. And this involves the UAE. They need to talk to each other. Saudi Arabia and the UAE haven't spoken to each other to this day. They're just issuing statements and mediating. Saudi Arabia issued a statement accusing the UAE of threatening its national security, and the UAE responded with a statement denying it and saying that it has no connection whatsoever to what is happening in Yemen. And this is in response to the UAE's denial that it has no connection. Regarding what's happening in Yemen, Major General Turki al-Maliki, the official spokesperson for the coalition forces, appeared and recounted everything the UAE did in detail. He said that the story began when the two ships arrived at the port of Al-Mukallaf in Hadramaut, Yemen. As soon as the ships arrived, unloaded their cargo, and were photographed from the air, Saudi Arabia discovered that the shipment wasn't just armored vehicles, it also contained containers of weapons and ammunition. So the Saudi army contacted the Emirati army and clearly informed them that neither the weapons nor the armored vehicles were allowed to leave the port. You unloaded them at the port. Don't take them out now. They'll stay there until you retrieve them and return them to the UAE. According to statements from the Saudi army, the Emirati army agreed and said, "Okay." But the surprise was that the vehicles actually started moving, and among them were the containers of weapons and ammunition. Large transport trucks came, loaded the containers, and took them to an Emirati base called Base Name Missing, Al Rayyan. So the Saudi army contacted the Emirati army again. Keep in mind that all communications are at the military level. They don't communicate at the political level. the Saudi army contacted the Emirati army and told them, "You've violated the agreement. Return the armored vehicles and weapons containers to whom?" They added, "I'll be forced to strike them right in the heart of the base." Keep in mind that this Emirati base houses Emirati officers, meaning if Saudi Arabia strikes the base, they will kill the Emirati officers. So, when the UAE realized that Saudi Arabia was taking the matter seriously, they moved the armored vehicles again and returned them to the port. However, what the Saudi army discovered was that the weapons and ammunition containers hadn't been returned with the armored vehicles. They remained at the Al Rayyan base. They demanded, "Move the weapons and ammunition containers, sir." But the UAE refused. This put the Saudi army in a difficult position. Firstly, and this is according to Saudi army statements, the Emirati ships deliberately turned off their tracking devices. It was on its way to Yemen, and that means you don't want anyone to see you, so you're doing something wrong. Even after it arrived at the port, it didn't abide by the agreement and moved the weapons, ammunition, and armored vehicles. When I objected and told you I'd strike, it moved the armored vehicles on its own and left the containers of weapons and ammunition. So, Saudi Arabia had to take action. Otherwise, the UAE would deal with what was happening in the same way it did when it occupied the Yemeni islands. It would ignore the situation and do whatever it wanted. Saudi Arabia made the decision and issued orders to the Saudi Air Force to strike the Emirati weapons. But then there was another question. Should we strike the containers of weapons and ammunition at Al Rayyan base and kill the Emirati officers? Or should we strike the armored vehicles parked at the port? Saudi Arabia chose to avoid killing the Emirati officers and decided to strike the armored vehicles, even though it knew they weren't. You can strike them all because they are located around the fuel tanks. Here's an important detail you need to pay attention to. Many people are very happy about the Saudi strike on the Emirati arms shipment, and even happier about the UAE's withdrawal from southern Yemen. But let me draw your attention to the fact that the UAE did what it wanted. First, the UAE delivered weapons and ammunition to the Southern Transitional Council forces. Second, while the UAE did withdraw, its withdrawal was actually intended to protect its forces. After all, it has already replaced them with Yemeni militias loyal to it. Third, and this is the most dangerous, if Saudi Arabia resorts to violence instead of negotiation, it will embroil itself in a new war that will drain it, just like what happened over the past 10 years of the Houthi war, and like what is happening now to the Sudanese army at the hands of the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, a complete drain on soldiers, money, and weapons. Meanwhile, the UAE is far away, moving its forces by phone. Therefore, this war must end through negotiation. There is no solution other than negotiation. By the way, the Saudi citizen, after fighting Iran and the Houthis and feeling secure that the UAE was behind them, discovered, according to Saudi statements themselves, that the UAE was stabbing them in the back. So, Saudi Arabia is now fighting Iran, the Houthis, the UAE, the Southern Transitional Council forces, and all the armed militias we mentioned earlier. Saudi Arabia is fighting all of them alone on its borders. And all this for what? Simply because it wants to secure its borders. Does resorting to negotiation mean that Saudi Arabia is weak? Does it mean that its army can impose its national security, for example? The answer is, of course, no. But the problem is that this is what the UAE is relying on. They're counting on Saudi Arabia resorting to violence to protect its borders and maintain Yemen's unity. So the result will be that the Saudi army enters a new guerrilla war, one that will drain its resources until Saudi Arabia is forced to agree to any political settlement, even if it's against its interests. So, what does all of this mean? This means the UAE won't fight because it has already withdrawn its forces. It means Saudi Arabia could get bogged down in a protracted guerrilla war for years. It means the UAE's withdrawal doesn't mean the end of the war because it left behind 2, 3, 4, and 5 militias instead of 1. It means the UAE managed to control the Yemeni islands and thus controlled the maritime routes south of the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden, and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. It means, folks, that the UAE isn't acting improvised. The UAE, as we mentioned in the previous episode, has plans and acts accordingly. Every step is calculated, along with its consequences. This detail alone is frightening to Saudi Arabia. They accuse the UAE of betrayal, even though they were once shoulder to shoulder. King Salman is now telling you that the UAE has broken all its promises to Saudi Arabia. The UAE has truly become a source of fear. What are they thinking? What do they want? If they're acting like this with their own people, what will they do with strangers? All these questions need answers, and most importantly, Saudi Arabia needs to calculate them correctly before resorting to further violence, which will likely serve the UAE's interests and help it achieve its goals. Here, the question for you is, do you think Saudi Arabia will fall into the UAE's trap and become embroiled in a guerrilla war against armed groups in Yemen? Or will it resolve the situation through negotiation to avoid a protracted war of attrition that it could lose?